All right, here we are, Section 4, World War One, and as I've been hinting at all through the week, the war's going to end badly for everybody, and in fact, bring about the next war. So, we had that armistice, that ceasefire yesterday at 11:11, November 11th, 11 a.m., 1918, and everybody stopped shooting, but that doesn't mean anything's been settled. So, the Allies meet, the winning side meets, and debates what to do next. And the key leaders are called the Big Four. Okay? Now, hundreds of nations send representatives to this meeting hoping to get things, but the Big Four allied nations have the most say in what happens. And this is them. And this is David Lloyd George from Britain. And this is Vittorio Orlando from Italy. And this is Georges Clemenceau, the Tiger, from France. And the tall, awkward-looking fellow is President Woodrow Wilson from the United States, first sitting president to ever visit Europe. And here are their names. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson from the U.S., Georges Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, and Vittorio Orlando. And they're the winners, and so they get to decide what's going to happen. There's a minute. Take a minute, pause here, write those names down. Okay, those would be good multiple choice questions. Good, here we go on to the next slide. So, by the time the U.S. got in the war in 1917, it had already proven to be the deadliest, worst war ever. Millions of people killed, and nothing really accomplished. So Wilson said, if we're going to enter the war, we have to make this war about something worth all of the sacrifice. And so he says, this war will be worth it if it's the last war ever. That's why they didn't call it World War I. If we have permanent peace and we never fight again, then maybe all this bloodshed will have been worth it. So he comes up with a plan for peace. It has 14 points for a peaceful world, and he calls it, get ready, the 14 points. All right? And so basically it's Wilson's recipe for a peaceful world. If we'll just do these 14 things, we won't have another world war. Okay? And so he calls for free trade between nations, no more empires, an end to secret alliances, which we didn't really get to talk about, but it was a secret alliance that brought Italy into the war in 1915, and it was alliances in general that made the war explode so quickly in 1914, and also a limit on how much military we have. It's basically limiting a nation's arms, in terms of battleships and eventually tanks and weapons and troops and all of that. So if we can limit our military, not have any secret alliances, and trade freely with one another, that will help reduce tensions around the world. He also is a big believer in what's called self-determination. Now, this is what you want, and some of you have. Self-determination means you say what you do. No one else is in charge of you. And basically, he puts this on a national level and says, peoples of the nations of Europe, you should not be in big empires, right? That's one of the things that started this war in the first place. You should be able to have your own nation, and you decide how you want to live and what you want to do. As we'll see, Wilson is, especially by our standards, pretty racist, and self-determination only applies to white people, and only certain white people. Other nations aren't going to get to have self-determination. He also wants to have this sort of permanent club where all the nations have representatives and they all meet together and we talk about things before things get out of hand and before we get into another war. And he's going to call that the League of Nations. Okay, we currently have the United Nations, which we'll talk about when we get to World War II, but he wants this League of Nations where it's a permanent meeting of all the leaders of all the nations and we can talk things out instead of fighting them out. So what do we actually get? Wilson's plan was nice, but what actually comes about? Well, we call it the Versailles Treaty because it was signed back in Louis XIV's Palace of Versailles, which was a nice place to hold a peace conference. And it's the height of French political culture and triumph, so the French wanted to hold it there. And Britain and France and Italy, they don't really care about Wilson's plan. You'll learn a lot more about this next year. But Britain and France especially, they've been bleeding since 1914. They've lost millions of men. Okay, they're not as interested in a peaceful world as they are in punishing Germany and protecting their empires. Remember, the United States declared war in 1917, and we didn't get into combat until 1918. We were only actually in the war from June till November. We lost 54,000 men, which shows you how deadly the war was. But compared to the other powers, we've barely gotten our, nails scratched. So they say, we want more than that. We didn't give up all this just to have a peaceful world. We want payback. And so Germany is brought in and forced to sign what we now call the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919. All right, so months after the end of the war in 1918, they finally do the peace agreement. And here's a rendition of, these are in the foreground, these are the Germans forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. And here are the Allied leaders signing it. And I remember I said Japan was one of the allies. And so you have Japan here. And these are all the peace documents. This is the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, which we talked about last semester. So I know you remember it. One thing Wilson does get is he gets his League of Nations, which is supposed to keep wars from happening again. It's not going to happen, as you know. And another thing that the Treaty of Versailles does is it says the whole thing was Germany's fault. And it says, since you started it, because remember, Germany declared war against Russia and France. And so they're deemed having started it, even though it really started with Austria declaring war against Serbia. But essentially, the Germans are blamed for the war, and when something's your fault, you have to pay for it. And so the Germans are going to agree to pay for the whole war. And that bill's going to come due in about a year from the time of the peace conference, and we'll see in the next chapter what effect that has on Germany. So the Germans are going to be forced to pay for all the stuff that got broken during the war. They're also going to lose all of their colonies, and the colonies, again, these are not white people, so they don't get self-determination. They are ruled by the League of Nations until the people running the League of Nations decide that these other people are politically mature enough to run their own countries. So that makes a lot of people unhappy who would like to have freedom. So all of this happens, and you may wonder, well, if this was so bad for the Germans, they have to give up their colonies, they're going to have to pay a ton of money, they're going to have to give up most of their military, a lot of their own territory in Europe. Why the heck did they sign it? Well, Britain, like we said in the last section of notes, they have a really powerful navy, and they had been blockading, right? We talked about that word, all of Europe, not letting anything in or out during the war. And even though the fighting has stopped, Britain won't let anything in or out until Germany signs. So they're starving Germany and Austria until they sign the peace treaty. So Germany really has no choice but to sign this deal that they are not at all happy about in order so they can start getting food and medicine and things again. So this doesn't really satisfy a lot of people. And that's why this next slide, pause here if you're not done with this one, is called a troubled treaty. Okay. So we're going to create a lot of new nations in Europe all at once. Okay. And your bonus word, one of them for this lecture, there weren't any in the last one, is accords, okay, like Hondas, okay? So underline accords, circle it, highlight it, put arrows around it. That's your bonus word for this slide. And so basically the map of Europe is going to change. Well, we just did a map, I know, but we're going to do another one next week because the map of Europe changes quite a bit. 4 empires disappear as a result of World War I. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. They're all gone. And they're going to be replaced by a bunch of independent countries. And so the map is really going to change. Let me show it to you here. All right, so this is the map. This is much like the map you did last week. All right, we see the big German Empire, the big Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire. We see Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. They all lose the war, and they get their empires split up into independent countries. So if you go over to this 1919 map, we have a country called Germany. Austria and Hungary are split now into 2 countries called Austria and Hungary. We have a brand new country filled with Czechs and Slovaks and Germans called Czechoslovakia. Down here in the Balkans, where the trouble all started, we are putting a bunch of different people into a country called Yugoslavia. Okay, so we get basically Central Europe changes quite a bit. We get this chunk of Germany out here cut off from Germany by Poland called East Prussia. We get what are we going to call the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. A whole bunch of brand new countries that are going to try to run things for themselves. And that's going to be difficult in the years to come. The former Turk lands are turned into mandates. Again, these people aren't Western Europeans, so they don't get to have full control of their territory. And so the League of Nations continues to run them as mandates. This is when the Middle East that we're so involved in for all of your life and most of mine takes shape. This is when they create countries like Iraq and Iran and Syria and Jordan and Lebanon. Not Israel yet. But essentially, sitting around maps in Europe, they create these countries in the Middle East. And the people in these countries don't always want to be in the same country together. That's why we're still having so much trouble in the Middle East now. So, Southeastern Europe, we get new countries. I showed you in the map. Russia has to give up a ton of land to get out of the war in 1917. They don't get all of it back after Germany is defeated. So new countries are created like the Ukraine and Belarus, but they are going to be reabsorbed pretty quickly into the Soviet Union. All right, so pause here if you're still copying this stuff down. And here we go to the next slide. All right. So, essentially, this peace is not going to last. Do you guys still know what quicksand is? It's not stable. Okay, they're building their house on wet sand, and it's going to fall down very soon. So, the Treaty of Versailles, to sum it up, it's not harsh enough and it's not fair enough. So it's harsh enough on Germany to make Germany bitter and angry, but it doesn't end Germany as a country and reduce their ability to do anything about it. And it doesn't reward the French and the British enough to make them happy. And so there's really bitterness on all sides. Nobody likes the deal. What some people say is a sign of a good compromise, but not in this case. Everybody feels cheated, and all these different countries are going to respond in different ways in the coming years. The German people obviously are the most bitter. They're forced to take the blame for the war. They're going to be the bad guys for quite a while now. And as we'll see in the next unit, a lot of Germans, especially German soldiers, feel, look, we never lost the battle. We took all this land and no one took it away from us. How the heck did we lose the war? And so we get this feeling of bitterness. Perhaps the most bitter German is this bitter German. Here he is as a bitter baby. And here he is as a bitter middle schooler. And here he is as a bitter teen. And then if you don't know who this is yet, here he is as a bitter and deranged adult. Okay, so this guy, as we'll see in the next unit, was a veteran of World War I, was wounded several times, and was told in the hospital that his country had lost the war. And that's when he decides to get into politics. What you'll learn more about next year, and it's pretty interesting as far as history goes, America never signs the Treaty of Versailles. Most people back in the U.S. remember that we're on the whole other side of the planet. We have two giant oceans, and we don't want to be in this League of Nations because what could happen? That could get us involved in another war. We don't want some other group telling the United States, okay, we're going to fight a war now. So Woodrow Wilson comes back from Europe, and he's not popular anymore, and he's a Democrat, and the Republicans are able to convince the American people not to sign this treaty, and so Congress doesn't approve it, and we don't join the League of Nations. Also not joining is Russia. Remember, Russia had a revolution, and they've been taken over by communists, so they're not even invited. So the League of Nations is going to go forward without the richest, most powerful nation, the United States, and the biggest single nation, Russia, as members. So it's not going to have a lot of power to do stuff. And we are going to stay out of involvement in Europe. We're going to realize, again, like I said, we have our own continent. We essentially run this side of the planet. And the United States, before World War I, I don't remember the graph that we did, the Industrial Revolution graph? before World War One, it was the leading industrial power already. But after the war, after these European nations destroyed themselves, the United States is a richer, bigger industrial power than the rest of the world combined. So the people of the United States want to focus on that, understandably. And so we don't get involved in European affairs until they completely break apart again. And some former colonies are angry about not winning independence, places like Vietnam, India, countries in the Middle East that had been promised, especially places like what we now call Saudi Arabia, that had helped against the ethnic Arabs in the Ottoman Empire, had helped us or helped the British fight the ethnic Turks, and they want to get rewarded for that, and they are not. Japan and Italy were both allies, and they were both promised things that they didn't get, so guess which side they're going to go in on the next war. All right, so that ends the fighting and temporarily settles issues from the war, but as we'll see, it doesn't really fix anything. So that was the notes for this chapter. Going forward, enjoy the rest of the work. Do your guided reading for this section. Have a wonderful day, and be glad you were never in World War I.